Okay, so Peter's already told you who I am. From James Cook Uni, the College of Science and Engineering. And like any talk, there's a whole lot of people that have contributed to the work that I'll show you tonight, and that's some of the main ones that have contributed to this stuff. I'd like to first point out those quotes that I had you reading first are all about 10 years old. And I asked this question, why are we being so slow to respond to this? I don't know if it's whether it's the scientific uncertainty that gets to people, whether it's just plain denial, whether it's just plain stupidity, or whether we've got, just dinosaur politicians who only care about the next election. Maybe a bit of all of those things. But anyway, we're now in what's now commonly being called the Anthropocene, the first time in the world's history where the world has been changed completely by people rather than just geological processes. And you can see that in any number of ways across the world. This is just a recent paper that came out this year where it very detailed analysis on the human impact across the world. And this is not including climate change, I should add. And you can see the normal kind of very big high impact areas like Southeast Asia, down the Andes, a lot of Africa and so on, and some of Southeast Australia. So basically, we've completely and fundamentally changed the world, the functioning of natural ecosystems, and like it or not, we are losing species and the services that not only provide for the real world, for the natural world, but also we depend on as well. Now, we're really lucky here, of course. We're sitting right between two amazing World Heritage areas with the Wet Tropics rainforest and the Great Barrier Reef, and unfortunately both are severely being impacted and threatened by climate change. I like to start off with saying that I had no intention of working on climate change. I used to be quite happy being a field biologist and working on cool things like leaf-tailed geckos, and it was a specific graph that completely changed the course of my career and life in a way, and it's this one here, which I published a long time ago now, in 2003, and it basically predicted, with using really bad models, really early models, not a great deal of data, but it predicted that if we would get something like we were expecting, which is sort of, at that time we're thinking we might get about 3.5 degrees of warming, that 50% of the things I worked on would go extinct this century. That really shocked the Jesus out of me, completely changed what I did, and to be looking at completely about the impacts of climate change. So what I'd like to, convince you of tonight is that climate change is easily the most significant threat that we're facing for global biodiversity and in the wet tropics here, and that it's already impacting us severely. It's not something that's going to happen off in the future. It's happening right now. It's already happening, and it's going to get a lot worse. And I feel a lot of sympathy. I don't know if you guys down the back can read this cartoon in here, but basically it's like back in 1990, the climate's changing and it could be a problem. Yes, we really should be getting on with this in 2001. 2013, we really have checked and we're not making this up. 2019 is this mic on? And I feel a lot like this guy because I've been giving versions of this talk now for about 15 years, I think, and it's still happening. This is just, I'm going to give you a little bit of the background and the context, not just in Australia, but globally. I know you've probably all seen graphics and figures about climate change, but just to go through some of the background, this is showing the temperature change over the last 100 odd years or so, and you can see how much it's heated up by 2017. It's been a dramatic global heating. Now if you look at that in terms of the number of hot years, this is the annual mean global temperature, and you can see the last 4 years are all the hottest years ever. Last year, 2018, was the third hottest on record. The two hottest were also during an El Nino year, so it was drier, which also makes it hotter. And I like to sort of point out that this 18 of the 19 hottest years ever have been since 2001. So my son's 19, he's never actually seen a world that was a temperature that wasn't a record temperature for that year, pretty much. And of course, this is affecting things everywhere in the world. This is just one example. I could literally stand here for the next week showing you examples of this all over the world. This is the loss of ice in the Antarctic. Now we're up to about 2,000 gigatons per year of loss of ice, and that's raising sea level, I think, by about 8 millimetres a year. And that sort of thing's happening everywhere. So then, of course, okay, so what's going to happen in the future? So this is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is their predictions based on a range of scenarios depending on what the world does. You know, if we really get our act together and really cut emissions globally, we could keep it to 1 degree. We've already gone past that. In fact, if I actually put last year on that graph, that's where we are. That's where last year was. So not only is it, not only is it increasing, it's actually above even all of the variability, even the worst case of the worst case prediction. Not good. Last year, the IPCC put out a special report, I guess following on from what happened in Paris a few years ago, where basically it was said that we really need to keep the globe to below 2 degrees to avoid the worst impacts. And of course, that is a very big ask. What they did last year, they was put out a new report where they looked at that in a lot more detail and said 2 degrees is actually not good enough, that we really need to keep it below 1.5 to really minimise the impacts. And right now we're at 1.1. So we're well on our way to that 1.5 already. Not a lot of time. And of course that's going to have huge impacts. All I want you to look at in here really is that 2 of the things that are predicted to be the most severe impacts are unique threatened ecosystems. The resolution's not fantastic, I'm sure you can't read that. And extreme weather events are the 2 things that are the most immediate and biggest threat. Now, a lot of people don't understand why only a 1.5 degree change could make a difference, you know. You talk to my neighbour and he's like, it was 3 degrees hotter last week. What are you going on about? And the fact is that a very small increase in the average, you know, you get some cold days, you get some hot days, but a very small increase in that average means that you suddenly get a huge number more of the extreme days, the extreme events. And with any extreme event, extreme weather event, there's a few things you need to think about. You know, how intense was it? How frequent are you getting them? And how long do they last? And there's been a lot of good examples of that lately, and I'll mention a couple of them. If anyone wants to get some good information, the World Meteorological Organisation just released a report just last week. It hit the media on Friday, I think it was. You can look that up and you get a very good report that summarises the sort of latest, you know, the state of things as it is as of the end of 2018. So, but just to give you a couple of snapshots of some facts and figures, last year was our 3rd warmest year in Australia at 1.14 degrees above average. The summer was the hottest on record at 2.4 degrees above average summer. We've broken records on of the highest maximum temperatures, the highest minimum temperatures. Annually, it's gone up a lot. This summer we had, across Australia, there was 28 days consecutively that were classified as an extreme heat wave. Not just a heat wave, an extreme heat wave. This is the mean summer temperature in Australia for the last 100 years, and you can see what last year looks like. That's it there. That's this summer that's just finished. We had the hottest day on record in Australia with temperatures over 50 degrees out here. We had a week or so in January where the entire continent, almost, more than 90% of Australia was over 40 degrees. never before seen. And in fact, if you look at the sort of the records there, these dark orange areas here are the hottest heat wave ever recorded in Australia. So you can see it covered massive areas of the country. And then another extreme, in exactly the same time of the year, we had the driest, the lowest rainfall on record, these dark red areas, and the highest rainfall on record, all that happening at the same time. So I live in Townsville, and we experienced one of those. And so in the few days after that massive rainfall event in Townsville, you can see this fresh water or sort of silt plume going out, and that's 100 kilometres out into the ocean. There was so much water coming out of the Burdekin there. Now, of course, we had, if you look at the last 6 months in Australia, there's been a few extreme events. We had massive record-breaking floods in Townsville. Even the locals were getting a bit too wet just down the end of my street. That's just down the end of about 100 metres from my house. The crocs were actually getting out of the water. It was too wet in there. And then closely followed by massive flooding out in Western Queensland. And then, of course, if you go down to southern Queensland and New South Wales, there's been massive drought. We've had catastrophic fires in Tasmania. We've had the heat waves that I've already mentioned. And then, of course, we've had massive fish kills in the Murray-Darling system. We've had stock dying from the heat waves. That's dead horses. That was just purely from high temperatures. And of course, something's been happening here and all down the east coast of Australia is massive die-offs in fruit bats. It's actually these extreme events that do the damage. It's not the increase of on the global average of 1 degree. It's these extremes that do the damage. And it does a whole lot of things, not just to the wildlife. You know, you get massive pulses of increased human deaths during those heat waves. Livestock, wildlife, fires, even sort of where it starts to affect infrastructure, like causing power lines to sag and break. Lots of failed agricultural crops, and on and on and on. So I guess my field of research over the last 15 years or so has been this. What will this do to biodiversity? The stuff that I cared about, what I worked on when I was just a happy rainforest field ecologist. And secondly, what's already happening? So if you're a species or an animal out there in the forest, the conditions become too hot for you or too dry, whatever, outside of your comfort zone, you've really got 3 options. You've either got to move somewhere else, you've got to be able to adapt to that change, or you're going to die. And in this case of those horses, they died. So we put together a big review paper a bit over a year ago, a couple of years ago now, that we're looking at the movement side of things. Where are species moving and why? And a whole lot of people were involved in this, and they compiled data from all around the world about what species were moving and what the impacts of that were. And it's quite amazing when you put it all together, because it talked about how the actual species moving actually were changing the climate as well, that it was affecting human health and ecosystem health. And the examples were from everywhere in the world, in every different ecosystem just about. And just to give you an example, I mean, we actually wanted to write the title of this paper as "Species Moving Will Change Everything." The editor thought that was being a bit, a little bit too overwhelming. But this is an example where you get climate change, you get temperature increase. That causes mosquitoes to be able to shift their distribution. Of course, a lot of mosquitoes act as vectors for human diseases. So now you get the movement of disease into places that it's never been present before, things like malaria and dengue and so on. And of course that then, it's not only the human health angle, that then starts to flow on to, it means that governments have got to spend money on increased health. They've got to increase costs of eradication, control, all of these other things, all these other governance issues that come into it. So really just the point there is that it really does flow on to far-reaching consequences. In terms of what species might die, this is probably the latest paper that tried to do a global analysis, and it again looked at studies from all over the world. Basically, to sum all that up, if you average it across everything, this paper suggested that about 16% of all species could go extinct this century. That's actually conservative compared to some of the other studies. There was another study a bit earlier that suggested about 30% of all species. It changes from place to place. Now, we've already seen massive impacts of climate change extremes on the Great Barrier Reef, with very severe bleaching events that has severely damaged like a huge percentage of the Great Barrier Reef, especially in the top 2/3. And there's been 2 years in a row. I haven't actually seen the results from the last summer. But of course, what you get there is coral bleaching, getting covered with algae, another example of coral bleaching, and you get whole reefs turning into these dead coral, algal covered rubble. And of course, on coral reefs, just like in the rainforest, if you take out an important part of the environment, you have lots of flow-on effects. These are all fish that are in one way or another dependent on coral. And when you go from a system that looks like this to one that looks like this, there's about a 65% decline in the abundance and diversity of those fish. So massive impact. That's 2/3 of everything that lived on the reef. Okay, so to sort of sum all that up, we've got things like the ice sheets in the polar ice caps and glaciers melting and accelerating faster and faster. We're getting more frequent and more severe heat waves, sea levels rising, more intense rainfall events, flooding, droughts. We've got lots of species moving all over the place, massive wildlife impacts, and a lot of the things that we actually depend on, like fresh water and so on, are also being impacted by these events. So there's been a lot of observed impacts in Australia. This is a recent paper that came out just earlier this year. You know, everything from canopy dieback, shifts in vegetation types, local extinction in plants, even the size of birds is changing. And then the last example is something that comes from my work here, which is rainforest vertebrates with range shifts and population declines. And so that's what I'll talk about mostly here. So I'm going to talk to you about biodiversity and climate change here in the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area. And as you all know, what's going on here? As Peter pointed out, this is the most biologically rich area in Australia. There are lots and lots of endemic species, and that's obviously, you know, the reason that it was made a World Heritage Area back in 1988. Just to highlight that, we did a recent report for the Wet Tropics Management Authority, which kind of summed it all up and looked at the numbers of endemic species and which ones were of high conservation significance. And there's more than a quarter of the species in the region have got a high conservation significance. That's extraordinary. And in fact, if you look just at the species that are just within the rainforest, it's 60% of the species are really important species to conservation. They're either endemic, they're really ancient species that are really evolutionarily unique, or they're already threatened. There's 31 species that are in the top 10% of evolutionary distinct taxa on the planet. All summing up, very important place. So everything I'm going to show you now is based on 3 kinds of data, really. There's just point records of species. You know, Lewin's honeyeater at this place, and I've got about 400,000 of those. Standardised transects, which I'm going to present mostly just some results that are based on bird surveys and spotlighting tonight, but we've done a whole lot of other stuff as well. And then some spatial modelling of that data, which is like mapping their distributions and what might happen under climate change. I've got sites that go most of the region, from Mount Elliott just south of Townsville to up just south of Cooktown. The ones that I'll mostly talk about tonight is data from here, from the Atherton Tablelands, and the sites, my sites there go basically from near Ravenshoe down the elevational gradient to the coast there. In fact, all of those mountain ranges, the sites are set up kind of like that, where They go from the lowest part that I can get into the rainforest to the highest part, and they're at 200-metre intervals in elevation. And they're all selected to be as far away as possible from other major impacts. Like, they're not on the edge of cow paddocks and so on. They're usually in national parks. They're usually sort of right in the interior of the forest to get away from other confounding effects. So over the last 25 years, I've done about 3,000 bird surveys and about 1,000 spotlighting transects, a whole lot of other stuff, but they're the ones in yellow are the ones that I'll show you some data on. What all of that data gives us is a really powerful baseline set of information. So we can get really good information now on the distribution of pretty much every species of vertebrate in the region, at least, and a whole lot of invertebrates, but especially the vertebrates. And so we've got a really good idea now of what the pattern of diversity is, which places are higher biodiversity, which places are lower, etc., where most of the endemic species are, where the evolutionarily distinct species are. We can do lots and lots of analyses, which I won't show you tonight, but like relating that to, trying to understand that diversity. Is it associated with how much rainforest there is, the area, how productive the forest is, how many different types of vegetation, and an important one, how stable the rainforest has been during the last ice age. So that's just to sort of tell you there's a lot of data in there that going into these analyses, and we've done a lot of work trying to understand these patterns of diversity. But the thing I really want to talk about is how vulnerable is that diversity. So, predicting the future. Now, this is a model that we did about 10 years ago. I would love to tell you that it's changed. We've added a lot more data. We've added a lot more sophisticated modelling techniques. We've run under literally hundreds of scenarios, and it hasn't changed at all. It's been very robust. Now, this is just a bit of a graphic representation of Herbert River ringtail distribution. You can see Hinchinbrook Island there, and you can see that all of the records are up here in the uplands, on the tablelands and south. And if you run one of these distribution models, the red area there is where you'd say the species distribution is. And then, of course, we can look at how climate change would affect that distribution. It's a little bit of a crude thermometer down here. And with 1 degree, or 1.5 degrees, sorry, a significant shift up the mountain, and you can see there's not nearly as much red anymore. And as you go up, you start to get very pessimistic story. Now, we've run that sort of model. That's just a graphical representation. We've got much more complicated ones. Run it for not all of the vertebrates, a bit over about 220 species of vertebrates, all the ones that we've got decent data for. And you get a whole variety of responses, as you might expect from all different species. So the Lemuroid ringtail possum, there's a map of its distribution based on that model. And then this graph up here is showing you, as temperature increases, what the likely impact on the species would be predicted to be based on what we're expecting to get in future climates. Now, I say future climates because this was done 10 years ago, and we were predicting based on the IPCC scenarios. And I'll come back to that. Now, you can see that it's a very nasty curve. It suggests that Lemuroid ringtails would be in very serious trouble with probably 2 degrees of warming. And the two curves up there, I'll just point out, one is the loss of distribution area, and this is the loss of population size. So basically, it's losing population size faster than it's losing area. Another example, golden bowerbirds, very similar story. Now, these are both upland endemics, the ones that you'd expect to be the most severely impacted. And another example, Maclay's honeyeater, much more widespread, goes into a lot of different other habitats, goes down right down to the coast, and of course, it actually does pretty well. In fact, the predictions for that are that the population size would increase by about 50%. That's the only endemic species that the predictions are that it would increase. All of the other endemics are predicted to decrease. We've done that sort of thing for all of the vertebrate species. This is just another bit more detail on 3 of the ringtail possums, the lemuroid, Herbert River ringtail, and green ringtail. The different coloured ones there are just different trajectories off into the future depending on what the world does. Whether or not we cut emissions a lot, whether we cut emissions a little bit, or whether we don't do anything at all. The red one is if we just continue on our current track, and you can see that the red ones all send all of these species on a very rapid decline. If you put all of that together, this is the result that you get. Now, when I say put it all together, this is is using information from a whole lot of species, a whole lot of possible different futures, a whole lot of different ways of modelling the climate, and a whole lot of data. There's about 1 million distribution models summarised in that one little graphic. What it's telling us is our best estimate is that in the wet tropics of the endemic species, I've only illustrated the endemic species here, that about 2/3 of them would be either extinct or endangered by the end of the century, and that only a few would be completely okay. This is just another example of a similar analysis that was done a few years ago on the mountaintop endemic plants, and this is the predicted number of extinctions, this red line. So it's a very similar pattern for these mountaintop plants as well as the vertebrates. One important point though out of that is that this is the prediction that we would get if we continued on our current path. If we did something that was actually completely doable, technologically, economically, it's completely feasible, is a mid-range scenario of this one they call the RCP 4.5, and you can see how much difference it makes. We would, instead of looking at more than half of the species going extinct or critically endangered, we're down to a very small number and much greater number of species that are okay. And so
are those species percentages or actual numbers of species?
This is actual number of species. Yes. Okay, so they're all predictions. That's all models. It's based on a lot of field data. Like, as I said, the number of point records that went into those is about 400,000 records across 220 species. So it's not just simulations, it's based on a lot of field data. But it is still a prediction about what will happen in the future. The big question, of course, is, well, are we already seeing changes? You really can't see the names up there at all on this, but anyway. This is a list of about 50 species of birds. The ones that have got a little pink arrow there are the regionally endemic species. The ones that are above that line have significantly declined in their total population size over the last 15 years. Almost all of the endemics have undergone declines. There's been rapid population declines in 14 species that is statistically significant, and 6 of those ones are endemic. Now, there's also a lot of species that have increased, and these tend to be like the widespread generalist species that are more common in the lowlands, and they've expanded their distributions up into the mountains a bit further. So, out of basically 50% of the bird species that we've got enough data to do this analysis on have declined. Half already. And that's just in the last 15 years. If you sort of look at that in another way, if you look at which of the birds that are generalist, rainforest generalists versus rainforest specialists, you can see that it's those widespread generalists that occur in rainforest all the way up and down the east coast of Australia that have expanded, they've increased their population size, and the specialists have declined. One example of that, toothbill bowerbird. Basically, if you compare the population size based on our standardised surveys prior to 2008 and after 2008, there's been a more than 50% decline in the total population size of the species right across the whole region. So I had an honours student sort of do a little bit of an extra study on the toothbills last year to see what was happening. And basically, I won't even bother trying to explain this horrible graph down here. But basically the story is that prior to the last few years, the highest abundance that we got on toothbills was usually between about 700 and 900 metres. That was sort of 10 years ago, I guess. The density back then was about 1.8 per hectare based on our surveys. And now it's down to about half that at 0.9 per hectare. So that's down at sort of about 800 metres. Now the highest abundance occurs across elevation at about between 900 and 11. So basically it seems like that the optimum part of their distribution has shifted up the hill a bit. And if you look at that on an average right across, their density's declined by about half over the last 15 years. So it basically was just sort of like, I guess, checking and confirming that earlier analysis. Now some stuff on the possums, lemuroid ringtails. So I guess two main populations of lemuroids. There's the ones here on the Atherton tablelands and the ones up at, on the Carbine tableland, Mount Lewis. And of course, primarily brown here. And up at Mount Lewis, there's a fairly high percentage of the famous white ones. Now back in about 2009, I realised that I hadn't actually seen any lemuroids on our spotlighting transect for a couple of years. And that made me worried. Went back and looked a few more times, we still didn't see any. Ended up being quite a lot of press about that because a journalist asking me, was I worried about them? And I said, yes, I'm definitely worried about them. They'd certainly locally declined. We went back in about 5 years after the first one, which was in 2005. We went back in about 2009 and we set up more sites. We did find some possums on the other sites at very low numbers, but they were still hanging in there. And they seemed to be increasing in the subsequent years after that. Now, the reason that we think that they declined was this year here, 2005, which was a massive heat wave. Each of these bars is the summer heat wave going back to 1950 in terms of the number of days that the temperature went above the temperature that kills the possum. Basically, the physiology on the lemuroids is that anything above 28 degrees, it takes about 5 hours for them to die. Now, of course, the maximum temperature for the day might only occur for 1 hour in a day. So it won't kill it, but it's not very, it's pretty stressful for them. But on this year, there was 28 consecutive days where it went above 28 degrees. So there was a big population crash then. We had sort of lots of lemuroids back here. We had a few here, and then after that year, we had none on that side. In fact, we've never seen any lemuroids on that particular monitoring transect to the present day. But they were still there just down the road a little bit in the more intact forest that had never been logged. So somewhere in there we hit a threshold which was really damaging to the possums. Now I want to take you to probably the main reason I was giving this talk is this result, because this is the one that I think more than anything has really shocked me and really depresses me. Whenever I wanted to take people spotlighting up on the tablelands here, in a sort of away from the crowd, so to speak, I would go to this site. This is one of my monitoring sites at about 800 metres in Wurrunurrun in South Johnson area. And this had ridiculous numbers of possums. We've recorded up to 60 animals in a 1 hour, 1 kilometre transect. We would get 35 lemuroids. So this was a place that whenever I took groups of students out, it was the only place that all the students wanted to go. I want to go to the 800 site, I want to go to the 800 site, because they'd go to this, the other sites and they wouldn't see nearly as many possums at the lower elevations, down at 600 and 400 and so on. So I had two sites that had a lot of high density populations, 800 and 1,000 metres in this area. This is along the road there where we'd spotlight. And this is the first 10 years of data from that site. I don't know how many times I've done that site. It's about 60 or 70, I think, from memory. We're at that one transect. And you can see a lot of variability. But typically, we'd be seeing somewhere between 15, 20 and up to 33 possums in that 1 kilometre of road. 2000, for those who can't read the dates down here, 2014, 15, we probably did another. There's a lot of dots. Each one of these dots represents one spotlighting transect, but there's a lot on top of each other when they get to the same number. I think across here there's about, as I said, about 60 or 70. Now the numbers seemed a bit low, but if you look, it's still pretty much in the middle of the range, a little bit, about average, nothing to be worried about. In fact, I used to tell people up until about the middle of last year, I would say the possums have declined in some places, but on the Atherton tablelands between 800 and 1,000, they're still doing really well. And then 2016 and 17, yeah, again, you're not getting the really big numbers, but they're still up around the 12 or 13 possums per hour. And then 18 was the first time when I did these. There's actually 4 points there, 2 on top of each other, last year. And we only got about 8 possums, 8 lemuroids that is, on that transect. And I was just like, that's really weird. So I'd go back the next night and we'd do it again, and we've still got 8, and go back the next night, still only got 8. That's really low. That's starting to get scary. But I was away over most of the summer, and we had massive heat waves in January, so I really was keen to get up. And it was actually this talk, which when I was putting this graph together, I was like, I've really got to get up there and see what's happened now. So I came up last week, and this is where we were last week. So there's 4 transects there as well. So there's 4 repeats of exactly the same transect. Now, if you look at that over the last 8 years, that's the pattern. But I never realised that until a few weeks ago. And because it looked, when it was sort of compared to all of the previous data, this early years here looked like it was just sort of an average. Might have been declining a bit, but nothing too special. But when you look at the last 8 years, you can see there's been a dramatic and very systematic decline. And based on that particular site and that particular data, they would go locally extinct there by about 2022 if that pattern continues. And that's really scary. So I started looking at some of the other data. The other species are not as sensitive. We know that from doing the physiology on them. At that particular site, so we're still at 800 metres at South Johnson. Herbert rivers, they seem pretty stable through the years. A little bit of a worrying trend in the last year, 2018 and 2019. You can see they're low. Not really enough data to be that confident about that yet, but it's certainly worrying given what the lemuroids are doing. Green ringtails increased, and this has been a common pattern that we've seen at all of the sites over the last 20 years, where the number of greens have actually increased in the higher elevation places. And if you look at the physiology, that makes sense because they were actually limited by cold nights. Green ringtails were found at much lower elevations. They're a bit more broad in their tolerances than the herbies and the lemuroids. They've increased, but then again in the last year or so, the last 2 years, there's some worrying trends here as well that they're also starting to decline again. Sorry about the resolution there, you can't see very well. But now this is going up a bit higher, so this is 1,000 metres. So you'd think, it's a bit cooler, they should be a bit safer there. Basically, all 3 of the species show that they've been, over the last, this goes back to 91 at this site, so this is where I did my PhD back in the early 90s, and then have worked there continuously ever since, well, almost continuously. It basically seems like the numbers down there at 1,000 metres were increasing a little bit, and then have been slowly starting to decrease. Again, I wouldn't be very confident about some of these numbers. It's like the greens, it's only a couple of transects where we've seen these low numbers, so you can't be very confident without a bit more monitoring, but the trend is the same. That's the last 15 years of lemuroids at the 1,000 metres. So not as dramatic as at 800, as you'd expect. It's a bit higher, a bit cooler, but still a significant and reasonably consistent decline. So if you sum all that up, if you look back across our transects in the tablelands, it's actually quite a consistent story, because if you look at lemmuroids, we had sites at 600, and we were seeing lemmuroids at 600 metres until 2007. We haven't seen one since at that site, even though we keep repeating it over and over and over again, but we don't see lemmuroids anymore. Another site at 700 metres, and they were there up until 2014, but then we haven't seen any since 2014. At 800, which is one I've just been talking about, they appeared to be stable up until about 2017, but then I've just showed you the reality of that. At Carbine at Mount Lewis, I really can't be very confident about what's going on there. The numbers are so low, the spotlighting is a lot trickier there, and we only get like one animal every third or fourth transect, and so it's really hard to be robust there in any sort of statistics, unlike we can at this site where we get lots and lots of animals and we've got lots more sampling. So now I want to take you back to this model that I showed you earlier that was predicting what would happen 10 years ago. And we're now there, 1.1 degree. 1.1 degree would suggest, based on this model, that we would have lost about 2/3 of the population of lemmuroids as a whole across the region. And that's exactly what we've got at the 800 site. We're down to 25% of the previous population density, which immediately would classify the species. The data, if I submit this data to the IUCN or the EPBC, it would immediately qualify it for listing as endangered already. The story for the other ringtails, herbies, at 600 metres, they disappeared in 2008, a little bit after the lemmuroids. At 700, they've been declining since 2010. At 800, they seem to be stable, but maybe declining this year. And at 1,000, they seem mostly stable so far. Greens have been increasing, but now declining. And Daintree river ringtails have definitely increased in some of the upland areas. They were a bit lower elevation. The numbers up on Mount Lewis have definitely increased. So a very consistent loss at the lower elevations, and it's been sort of pushed further and further up the hill. And now we're getting declines in the core populations up high. I guess one of the things I'd like to advertise at this is that I would love anyone who's got standardised spotlighting transects, that they've got data going back over time that they could check to see whether they can, have they seen anything like this happening at other places on the tablelands. Because my sites were not set up specifically to monitor ringtails. We were set up to do a whole, across the entire region. So we spent many, many years working across the whole region, but it means we don't have as many sites just here on the tablelands. So if anyone knows of data sets that go across elevation that have got standardised spotlighting, I'd love to hear about them. So summing all of that up, a lot of the upland species have already declined and moved higher up. Some of them are now even declining in the uplands. They're disappearing at the lower, hotter end of their range. Some lowland species have expanded. And most of the species are showing the same trend, but we don't have enough data to show it statistically. Now keep in mind that this is in a World Heritage Area. It's fully protected, quite well managed, much better off than most of the rest of the world. And most other places in the world are already getting other impacts on top of climate change, in terms of habitat loss, poaching, all of those things, and that's that graphic I showed you earlier. And I think one of the really important things going into the future is going to be these combinations of climate change and these other impacts. So I said into the future. It's not the future anymore, it's already happening. These things are not something that we should be worried about by the end of the century, that we were worried about in 50 years. It's already happening and it's getting worse. So we've got to stop talking about the future. And a good example of that is what's happened in the Murray-Darling in the last few months, where we've had that exact combined set of impacts with climate change that have done the damage. We had low levels of environmental water flow due to too much being extracted, a drought occurring at the same time, higher temperatures causing more evaporation. You got runoff of different chemicals and fertilisers, etc., into the water, giving you poor water quality. You added on top of that a record-breaking heat wave where it went above 47 degrees. That was followed by a blue-green algae outbreak. Then there was a 25-degree drop in temperature overnight, which caused the water to mix. That caused a bacterial bloom, which consumed all of the oxygen, and then all of the fish died. So it was that combination of things, a combination of water management, a heat wave, pollution, all coming at the same time, and bang, you have an environmental catastrophe. I had a student, she was from Thailand, and she was interested in climate change and land use. So she actually did a study in Thailand where she looked at what would be the impact of climate change and what would be the impact of habitat loss, because they're still experiencing fairly high habitat loss across Thailand in the rainforest. And what she found was that there'd be a significant number of species becoming endangered from habitat loss, but a lot more species becoming endangered from climate change. And if you added the two together, you got an even more significant impact, where out of 300 odd species that she could do this for, it was like 260 would become endangered over the next 70 years due to that combination of land use change and climate change. Now, I'm running out of time, I think, but all of that stuff that I've just shown you, is not taking into account the biological characteristics of the species. And obviously every species is different. In the example I've been talking about, green ringtails, curl up in a ball and just sit out on a branch in the open air. So they're exposed to the air temperature under the canopy. Lemuroids climb down inside a hole and sleep during the day, so they might be a little bit buffered by being inside the tree, maybe. So you've really got to take into account a whole lot of biological factors. Now, over the years in my research group, I won't bother trying to even look at that. We just sort of put together this thing that was trying to look at all of the factors that might affect how vulnerable a species would be. And this was really a way that we could direct our research. Again, you can't read it on here, but there's about 100 odd publications that have come out looking at various different aspects of exactly that, to try and work out how vulnerable species might be. Whether or not a lizard that lives under a log is going to be less vulnerable than one that's out in the leaf litter, all that sort of finer detail biology. About the physiology, about how fast they breed, how well they can move, how specialised they are, what their behaviour is. All of these things affect how vulnerable a species will be. And of course, if we can include all of that in our analyses, you should get a more realistic assessment. I haven't got time to go through all of those analyses, but we tested that by comparing it to the past. We know there's been climate change in the past. We've got a pretty good idea of how the climate's changed in the past in the wet tropics. We could use that to test how well our estimates of how vulnerable a species was, how it's been affected by past climate change. And it worked really well, matched quite well, and that gives us a lot greater confidence in predicting the future impacts. If I put up a list of what I'd say are probably the most threatened species in the region now, it's a very long list. These are just the ones that are at the top. There's plenty of others. But basically all of the bowerbirds, the golden and the toothbill. Northern tinker frog is already gone due to the chytrid fungus. All of the ringtails, quite a few of the mountaintop microhylid frogs, and a range of other things like mountain thornbills, quolls, and if you look at these numbers, they're pretty scary. What these predictions are saying is that we're looking at about 60 odd species becoming critically endangered or extinct. This is all summarised in a report I did for Wet Tropics last year. What can we do? Well, we could agree to sign a pledge to hold another meeting to consider changing course at a date yet to be determined. Which is pretty much a description of the world's reaction so far. How much time have I got, Peter? Or should I? We're okay? Okay, because I'll show you a couple of things that I think actually can give you some hope. I have had students complain after I've given this lecture to undergrads saying that the university should provide counselling at the end of my lecture. And I guess the thing that I try and do, what I think I try to direct all of our science to do, is how can we use the science to make better decisions about the future? It's not going to save everything, it's not going to be perfect, but at least let's try and make the best decisions we can. So, depending on where we end up, if we don't do anything about it, well, what we do is not going to make much difference. It's going to be a catastrophe. If we did really strong mitigation and reduction of emissions, well then we might not have to do much at all. The fact is we're probably going to end up somewhere in the middle here where what we do will make a difference. How we can adapt our management will make a difference. What can we do? Well, we can either manage species or we can manage landscapes. By managing species, we need to know, well, which species are the most important? Which ones do we want to spend our money and our effort on? What places should we protect or restore? And what other threats can we reduce? Things like invasive species and so on. So whatever we do, it needs to be proactive. It needs to be because everything's changing. It needs to be predictive and looking into the future and being proactive about what we do rather than waiting for it to happen and then reacting to it like most conservation has been for the last 100 years. And it needs to be dynamic because everything's going to be changing as we go forward into the future. I always like this quote. It came from the unlikely source of an ice hockey player. And when they asked him why he was such a good ice hockey player, Wayne Gretzky, it's because I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been. And that's what we need to be doing with climate change. So, to be able to make good decisions, to be proactive and dynamic, we really need to take into account a whole range of different species and groups. We need to be thinking about, how important is it to save that group? Obviously, the endemic species in the Wet Tropics are super important in this region, but species that occur everywhere from New Guinea to Melbourne are not as highly significant to what we do in this area. We need to understand something about the species resilience, as I was mentioning. We need to know what places might be more resilient, the refugia, and how these things are connected across the landscape. And I know that the tablelands has been a real centre for habitat restoration and connectivity, and that's really important. Again, you can't read that. This was a framework that we set up to try and assist managers to make decisions, like what sort of things can they ask themselves about their particular region that might be important. And as you go down this decision tree, there's different questions and they become more and more difficult and expensive to do. But some of the questions are like, well, are there refugia in your area, in your national park, in your region, whatever it is you're managing? If there's no refugia, is there a way that animals and plants can move to get to another refugia? So movement pathways and refugia. Now we've done a lot of work on that over the last 10 years or so, and we've looked at everything from how much a small microhabitat protects species, things like epiphytes in trees. If you're a little frog or an insect, you get inside an epiphyte, it's cooler, it's moister, it protects you from a heat wave that lasts for a few hours to a few days, but it won't protect you against one that goes for a month. So microrefugia. We've also looked at the whole difference between species that live on the bottom of the rainforest and things that live up in the canopy, or things that can use both. If you're a species that can use the whole vertical range, the whole arboreal range in the rainforest, well, you're a lot more resilient, because if you're up in the canopy and it starts getting too hot and sunny, you go down a bit, and there's about a 9-degree difference between the top of the canopy and the rainforest floor. So you can adjust your temperature very well if you can climb up and down trees. Of course, if you don't have that ability, that doesn't help. There's some places in the landscape that are more resilient, that are refugia, and we did a lot of work in the earlier days. Paper here by Luke Hsu, looking at what parts of the wet tropics will be cooler than you might predict because they've got a good canopy, they've got lots of cloud cover, they might be on the slope of mountains that get afternoon shade, things like that. We looked at where they might be across the region, where are the coolest places. We compared that to where the World Heritage Area is and where has been cleared. And so we can sort of make some solid management recommendations using this because we can say, well, we've got these really high important areas like the top of Bartle Frere and Bellin and Kerr that have got lots of endemic species, it's in the World Heritage Area, it's intact, great, just make sure that they don't get any other impact. So if you're going to spend money on, managing something like weeds or something, well, that's a good place to do it because you're protecting a really important place. Other places were important but not in the protected area, so they're a good place to protect. Other places were a really important area, but they'd been cleared, so they're a really good area to restore. And in fact, a lot of these things have happened. Mount Baldy has now been included in the protected area estate. Wet Tropics Management Authority had a restoration project in some of these areas specifically aimed at resilience to climate change. So that's all fantastic. Now, one of the latest things that we did was how do we sort of pull all of this together? Like, we know that we need to protect species where they are now, we need to protect them where they want to be in the future, and we need to protect the places that they can get from A to B. If I'm a species and I'm sitting here and it starts getting a bit hot and I know that I need to get over to that table over there, over the next 50 years I've got to move over here, but I can only do that if there's habitat between here and there. So this analysis looks at where are the highest priority areas that have the most endemic species, the highest biodiversity, the most unique species in the region. Currently, these red areas here, like we're right in the middle of one here. And this is where it would be in 2085. Now you can see there's a lot of overlap there, which is great, because that means we can say to the managers, these are important now, they're important in the future, you don't need to make any harsh decisions there, they're still important. But then what we did was also add in some uncertainty. We sort of thought, okay, we're not sure what's going to happen to the climate, so we used multiple climate projections. We also know that each species is different biologically, so we put in some, for each species, we put in how far we thought they would be able to move per year or per decade, so whether or not they would be able to get from here to over there in the time required. We put in prediction uncertainty, the species resilience, movement capability, and we also ranked them on conservation importance. So now this is taking into account, this map takes all of that into account. And basically those red areas are the super important areas, and the pink, the next, and so on. So if you zoom in on the tablelands, you can see that the high elevation areas on Bellin and Kerr, Bartle Frere, Lamb Range and the Herberton Range are all really important, but also these pink areas designate the areas that are very important corridors for species to move. Now, of course, anyone who knows the area will know that this area here is the centre of the tablelands, and a lot of it's been cleared. So if we look at where the World Heritage Area is, of course, it's all of this more intact forest around the edges. But then our corridor goes right across the Atherton tableland, right where it's been the most cleared and fragmented. Now you might sort of say, well, won't species just move down through this continuous forest on the escarpment? And some species will. But what this is actually showing and taking into account is the fact that as the temperature heats up, species are moving up further and further up in elevation, and that these lower elevations will no longer be suitable for them to be able to move through. And that's kind of like the possums I was showing you. And so these lower elevations are sort of unsuitable for a lot of the species. And so I guess this just really highlights that these connections across here and up here are really important to try to get stepping stones and corridors and so on. If you look at the difference between having that corridor and not having that corridor, so this is a map of the number of species based on 200 species. green areas, more species. You can see the top of Bartle Frere, Bellin and Kerr. That's assuming, this map is assuming that in the future, that everything can get to wherever it wants to get to. So it's saying, okay, of those 200 species, where do you want to go in the future? And you can get there. But if you sort of make an assumption that they can't move unless there's continuous habitat, this is how many species you get up on the top of those mountains. You can see a really big difference. So a lot of the species that are currently at lower elevations, if they can't get there, well then you've lost that potential. I think I've said all that. Last example I'll show you is where we basically took this research that came from the Wet Tropics, and the government wanted us to do some analyses at the level of the whole of Australia, which we did. It was sort of tricky, but then the Queensland government also said, oh, we really love that as well. Can you do that for Queensland? And we did do that in collaboration with the Queensland government. And it came up with basically these areas that you'd prioritise for climate change resilience. And this is a result that I'm very pleased with, because they've now purchased, I think now it's up to 12 new national parks across Queensland that were specifically chosen to be in the places that would protect the most species the furthest into the future. And even better, it was done initially under Campbell-Newman government. because it wasn't called the Climate Change Resilience Program, it was called the Landscape Resilience Program. So anyway, yeah, so there's been a lot of new parks put in place for climate change. I'll just skip through that. I guess, what do we need to do now? What do we need to do next? We need to convince our government to act on reducing emissions. That is the biggest, most important thing that we need to do, because if a country like Australia can't do it, I mean, we really need, even though we're not a huge player in the sense of our absolute number of emissions globally, we really need to lead by example. In terms of what research we need, well, we really need to prioritise it very carefully based on how significant it is, how urgent it is. And we need to increase the capacity of our decision makers so that they're actually making decisions that take into account all of these things with climate change and actually make at least the best decisions that they possibly can. And that's what this is about. Sort of, you need to make that, in the middle there it says, you know, good decisions basically, and you need good biodiversity science, you need long-term monitoring, you need to synthesise that, you need to exchange information. So for about 8 years I was the director of this thing called the National Climate Change Adaptation Network for Biodiversity under this, the NCARF facility, and during that time we produced priorities for terrestrial biodiversity, for marine and for fresh water. And then last year we got together with all of the people that had written the other marine ones and the freshwater ones, and we thought, what are the most important things that are relevant to all ecosystems in Australia? And these were the top 6 things that we need to do. Interestingly, from a group of physical scientists, we came out that the most important question was, what are the social barriers, so social research. We emphasised the importance of long-term monitoring, changing what we do in conservation to be more proactive and dynamic. We need to look into the future. Extreme events, as I've been talking about a lot, super important. We need to be able to assess vulnerability so we can make good decisions, and we need to include that into our policy and management. Last thing to mention, just a reminder that I've been talking about vulnerability of ecological species and processes. Just a reminder that our socio-economic vulnerability is very much tightly linked into that ecological vulnerability, a lot more than most people know or realise. So, to finish, we're in an amazing region. This biodiversity that we've got here is not just threatened by future climate change, it's already disappearing as we watch. We need to do a whole lot of things. I won't go through them, I've already mentioned them, things like protecting refugia, connectivity, reducing other things like invasives. We need to put pressure on our governments to reduce emissions. And I would argue that this is the most important thing that we're facing currently in the world. It's not the economy, it's not jobs or wages growth, immigration, or whether or not our MPs have got dual citizenship. This is much more important, and we really need to do something about it. Thank you.